Thank you. Oh, and here's Mary.
Hello.
Good morning.
Sorry to be at the last minute. It's just early here and I had to get my kid and my dog off.
We understand. We're so glad you're here. And good morning to everyone who's joining us. It's so nice to have you all here. I am beyond delighted to welcome you all to this event on behalf of myself, Richard Petz, who's the Virtual Conference Series co-organizer, Melissa Milkey, our WFRN president, and Steve Sweet, our executive officer. We are so delighted to have you all here for this fabulous group of scholars discussing a really terrific book that if you don't own already, I urge you to go out and grab after the event. Today, we're here to celebrate and discuss Dr. Claudia Goldin's Career and Family, Women's Century-Long Journey Toward Equity. We're going to begin with some remarks from Dr. Goldin, followed by comments from our illustrious group of readers. We're going to go alphabetically, so I'll introduce them as they come in. And then we will open our discussion up to questions from the audience. I want to let you all know that we will be recording this session. So if you remain on the Zoom, you're consenting to the recording. The recording will be available for WFRN members in our members section of our webpage after the event. And then finally, I just wanted to let you all know that it is that time of year that it's WFRN's member drive. And these types of events that we're having today are possible because of the support of our membership. So if you have not yet renewed for this year, I'm going to strongly encourage you to go over to the chat where Steve Sweet has put a link in to go straight to the member page after the end of the talk and renew your membership. And now I am honored to introduce today's author, Dr. Claudia Goldin, who is the Henry Lee Professor of Economics at Harvard University and has such a stellar resume. I actually couldn't decide what I should highlight when I was thinking about it, but she's the author of numerous books. She's won an amazing amount of awards and recognition of her tremendous scholarship, and we're just so delighted to have her here today. So Dr. Goldin, we'll begin with you.
Well, thanks very much, and thank you for organizing it. There are many organizers of this. I am deeply appreciative of all the work and of this network, which long ago when I was at Penn, I knew Jerry Jacobs very well. And he and others did an amazing job putting this together. It was incredible foresight. So in 1963, Betty Friedan wrote about college women who were frustrated. They were stay-at-home moms. And today, 60 years later, college graduate women are largely on career tracks. Women graduate from college at far higher rates than men. They earn advanced degrees at about the same rate, but their earnings and promotions relative to those of the men they graduated with and to whom they are often married continue to make them look as if they've been sideswiped. These women, to paraphrase Friedan, have a problem with no name. My book puts a name on it, greedy work, and I'm going to explain that. But first, let's be historians and go back in time a little bit. I show how 5 distinct groups of women, we would call them birth cohorts. I was told when I wrote the book that I couldn't use the word cohort, that my audience wouldn't understand the word cohort, so they became groups. So I still call them groups. 5 distinct groups of women, and they're mainly white women. They're not all, of course, but they're mainly white, who graduated college from 1900 to the early 2000s, responded to the problems of balancing career and family as the 20th century progressed and as a sea change in the labor market and the household altered work and marriage and childbearing. And the groups sort of divide naturally by their achievements and often by their aspirations. Just to give you a little preview of this, just 3 groups. Group 1 graduated college from 1900 to 1919, and it had either family or career. Just 50% had children. If we fast forward to group 3, graduating from the 1940s and the mid-1960s, more than 90% married, and around 90% of them had children. You can't get anything that different in a relatively brief period. They had family and then job. Group 5 is the most recent, and they want career and family. They have delayed both marriage and childbearing. They've greatly increased their success at career and have also increased childbearing from group 4, which was the first to say, I want career, then I'll have family. This group is saying, I want both career and family. But of course, we still are not there. As many barriers to women's careers have been removed, and we have gained a sharper vision why equity for different sex dual career couples remains stubbornly out of reach, and what that means for gender equality. So the point here is that we have couple equity on the one side and gender equality, the two sides of the same issue. The new problem with no name, as I said, is greedy work. And by greedy work, I mean jobs for which working more hours or particular hours or working harder during certain portions of one's life have disproportionate returns. If doubling the number of hours, let's say from 35 to 70 per week, more than doubles the implicit hourly wage, we then have greedy work. Couples with children or other care responsibilities will be enticed by the greater income of greedy jobs to give up couple equity. When a couple gives up, and that's a different sex couple, gives up couple equity, they increase gender inequality for themselves, and they also increase it for the entire economy. I'll explain why and what might be done about it. Children take time. I needn't tell anyone in the audience with children. Parents often do as well. I heard about a dog. Dogs do, mine does as well. We have lots of care responsibilities. So they take time, and at least one working parent must be what I call on-call at home. But on-call at home jobs, let's say that small boutique law firm, pay far less than the on-call at the office job, let's say that Park Avenue law firm. On-call at home jobs enable more flexibility at work. If both members of the couple took the flexible job, let's say each would earn, let's say $120,000 a year. Alternatively, one could take the greedy job and earn $150K per year, while the other remains at the flexible job and earns the $120. Couples are thus enticed by this additional $30K a year to give up couple equity. Because women are generally the ones who take the on-call at home jobs, gender equality is thus thrown under the bus along with couple equity. With couple equity, they would earn the same amount. Without couple equity, women in this case get 80% of what men earn. Couple inequity and gender inequality are the two sides of the same issue. The issue of greedy work is a main reason why women with care responsibilities earn less than men. Yes, of course, there's real discrimination, there's sexual harassment, there's bias among managers and supervisors, and we should stomp on it just like we stomp on cockroaches in a New York City apartment. But even if we brought in the giant exterminator, we would still have a significant gender inequality in earnings for the reasons that I've given. So let me end with what could be done. 3 things. One is to reduce the cost of flexibility through better substitutability in jobs. Create teams of substitutes, improve handoffs between professionals with information technology, reduce the need for long distance travel. The new world of hybrid work has been moving in that direction. After all, we're all together and very few of us had to travel very far. I will have a bit to say about this new world of work in a moment. The second thing that can be done is lower the costs of caregiving. And the third, the most difficult, is changing gender norms and getting men on board. And we may be moving in that direction. But knowing what the problem is and giving it the right name helps enormously. It doesn't solve the issue, but it focuses our attention on the real problem. It is also important to acknowledge the enormous progress that we have made in the last 120 years. Let me say a bit more about this point that I made in the context of our collective experience during the pandemic, the point about reducing the cost of flexibility. The dark cloud that hung over our pandemic year, and I perhaps should put an S, our years, have produced a silver lining for women in the workplace. As offices and schools shut down and as going to work was radically redefined, flexibility jumped to the forefront of the workplace discussions. The potential for these changes to have permanently lowered the price of flexibility is part of the pandemic's silver lining. Whereas the job with flexible hours paid far less than the greedy job before the pandemic, previously greedy jobs are now more flexible, and the previously flexible jobs are now more productive. The working couple with children or with other care responsibilities can now have a more equitable household without giving up as much income. The on-call parent will be able to compete for the previously greedy job. And employers will expand the previously flexible jobs because these jobs have become more productive. As a result, the difference between the wages of the previously greedy and previously flexible jobs will narrow. Consider mergers and acquisitions work that once had to be done in Tokyo or the contract that needed to be signed in Zurich. We've learned that they don't actually need to be done in person. The on-call at-home parent, generally the mother, hadn't been able to take on these remunerative jobs and do these transactions. But now they can be accomplished without being away in the evening, without flying across an ocean. The flexible job has become more productive. The greedy job has become more flexible. The move back to the office has been slower than many had imagined, but there are some aspects that are crystal clear. The new normal is different from the old. More Americans and those elsewhere, especially more educated ones, have greater flexibility when they work and where they work. Flexibility at work has become cheaper. With the new normal in the office, will it serve to help even out differences between greedy and flexible jobs, between men and women with care responsibilities? I'm cautiously optimistic that it will, as long as we don't inadvertently or purposefully create a work-from-home female enclave. We will have reduced the price of flexibility, increased the productivity of flexible jobs, enhanced couple equity, and reduce gender inequality. Is that a silver lining? It sounds more like gold. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. I know everyone is joining me and clapping from home. And we're so excited to continue the discussion. Our first reader today is Dr. Mary Blair-Loy, who's a professor of sociology at UC San Diego. And I am going to let you take it away.
Oh, thank you, Sarah. And thank you everyone at the WFRN for this amazing opportunity to join together with Professor Goldin, the author of this remarkable book. It is ambitious and sweeping, data-rich, and extremely readable. Professor Goldin, I could find in the contours of your groups women important to me, my two grandmothers, my mother, and even myself, using the descriptors of your chronological groups. And that was just a gift to read and feel that I was part of history. As Professor Goldin has just described, she argues that in heterosexual couples, after marriage, and especially after children, women are more likely to become the parent on call to the child, while men are more likely to be the parent on call to the employer. And that many couples decide to specialize since they don't want to lose out on the higher income of at least one person working the greedy job, and therefore sacrifice couple equity and perpetuate gender inequality. This book accomplishes a great deal. Yet there is still more of the story for other social scientists to fill in. I point to the need for more analyses of culture. In Goldin's work, it is not clear why this gender specialization continues, especially since gender role attitudes have become so much more egalitarian in the last several decades, for example, as measured by the General Social Survey. And other than the requirements biologically for women to take a few days off of work to birth their babies, it's not clear why women disproportionately take the predictable job while their husbands take the greedy one. And so one way to try to approach this is to better understand not just individual norms, but broader cultures and how they're linked to things like race, ethnicity, occupation, and country, which really structure the options from which people feel out what is the right decision for their family. Some of these cultural insights come from purposive, systematic, in-depth interview studies of relatively large qualitative samples, carefully selected to illuminate the research questions at play. And briefly, I'd like to offer 4 examples of this kind of research that we might consider reading alongside of Goldin's book. Dawn Dow's book, Mothering While Black: Boundaries and Burdens of Middle-Class Parenthood, which is about professional women in heterosexual unions, and also Mignon Moore's book, Invisible Families: Gay Identities, Relationships, and Motherhood Among Black Women, which is about a social class diverse sample of gay Black women. These 2 books show us in different ways that cultural beliefs of many Black women include a broader interdependency beyond a 2-parent family unit. Dow and Moore, in their separate amazing books, illuminate the historically rooted and personally compelling beliefs among many Black mothers that economic self-sufficiency is highly valued, and being a good professional role model is not competing with motherhood, but rather part and parcel of being a good mother. Further, these mothers help solve the care dilemma by relying on broader communities of kin and near kin to be the ones on call for the predictable and the unpredictable needs of children. Another excellent example is Caitlin Collins' book, Making Motherhood Work, which analyzes in-depth interviews with 135 middle-class employed mothers in the US, Italy, Germany, and Sweden. And she finds distinctive differences in these mothers' ability to make motherhood and employment work, which are linked to national cultural contexts and the federal policies and economic resources available to the families in each group. Lastly, I'll mention my book with Aaron Seck, Misconceiving Merit, Scientific Excellence and Devotion Among Academic Scientists and Engineers, because it studies a large group of academics designed to illuminate in a case in which everyone, women and men, parents and non-parents, everyone in this study has chosen the greedy on-call occupation. In this study, there are no mean differences by gender or by motherhood status, and hours worked or dedication or academic productivity. Yet the mothers are viewed by others as less productive. Even though their dedication is as robust and their scholarship as impressive as the colleagues who are not mothers, they are assumed to lack the dedication to their scientific calling. They are culturally defined as less excellent. In sum, in the division of labor among social scientists, Goldin does her job extremely well. But there are more insights to be mined, particularly from sociologists and other social scientists who study gender, work, and family, who use systematic qualitative methods to illuminate mechanisms of cultural commitments and cultural constraints. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mary. That was wonderful. Now I am delighted to introduce you all to Dr. Janet Gornick, who's a professor of political science and sociology and the James M. and Kathleen D. Stone Distinguished Chair in Socioeconomic Inequality at the City University of New York Graduate Center.
Thank you so much. It's an honor and a pleasure to be part of this panel. I want to start by underscoring what others have said. This book, an elegant blend of economics and history, a mix of quantitative analyses and storytelling, is beautifully written and a model of clarity. It was really a pleasure to read. I do just want to say that I've been using Professor Goldin's first name, Claudia, in my notes, and so I'm going to continue with that informality, which I hope is okay with everyone. In the spirit of COVID, I've relinquished all formalities, I think, in the last few years. One thing I want to say, Claudia made reference to this early in the book. In fact, on page 24, she presents a novel periodization identifying 5 groups or cohorts of women, which she depicts succinctly in an eye-catching schematic. The vision that she provides is a wonderfully effective synthesis of a century of change, and it anchors the book. I recommend that all of you open the book and turn immediately to page 24 and take a look at this schematic, which is really quite remarkable. I would also say that Claudia's key thesis is persuasive. She has said this already, but in short, she argues that many jobs are greedy and that greediness deters women more than men, thus driving and sustaining persistent labor market gender gaps. Turning her attention to different sex couples, she explains why couples drift into specialization, partially, if not completely, because not doing so, and that's because not doing so would be costly. She demonstrates that sharing and sharing alike, or as Francine Deutsch called it, halving it all, is for most dual career couples in the US not financially practical. And the final piece of the picture is that due to what Claudia labels gender norms, it's women who lean out, shifting time from employment to unpaid care work in the home. I agree with all of this. That said, I want to offer 2 reactions, both, of course, in the spirit of some friendly critique. The first relates to the treatment of public policy, and the second, much briefer, relates to the definition of family and some normative language associated with that definition. So first, I think that Claudia underemphasizes the potential of government, meaning public policy, to change the status quo that she so meticulously describes. Instead, she places the burden of change, both implicitly and explicitly, overwhelmingly on employers. As is common when talking about work-family reconciliation policy in the US, Claudia notes in a few places that other rich countries have more generous policies, especially pointing to publicly supported childcare and various forms of leave. And in doing so, she notes two findings that might at first blush seem inconsistent, but actually they're not, as she acknowledges. One is that the natural experiment that cross-national policy variation offers indicates that these policies do reduce many gender disparities in the labor market, most markedly in employment rates. Claudia notes, although to some extent in passing, that other countries generously finance high-quality childcare, and she writes about other countries. This is one reason why the labor force participation rates for prime-age women now exceed that in the US, even though the US rate had exceeded theirs for most of the post-World War II years. That is, of course, true. Her other observation is that worrisome gender disparities remain, even in the much celebrated Nordic countries. She writes that data from several Nordic countries provide evidence for conclusions similar to the MBA study, that is the US-based research that she describes, which focuses on high-achieving women, and that's also true. So if generous work-family reconciliation policies are advantageous for gender equality, why do these disparities remain? In my view, the recognition that these disparities remain everywhere often deters support for these public policies. And I think that Claudia unintentionally adds some fuel, maybe unintentionally, adds some fuel to that line of thinking. So why do disparities remain everywhere, even in countries with the most extensive policy supports? Let me point to three reasons. First of all, no country on earth goes far enough. In particular, there are no countries with fully egalitarian leave policies. They all have design elements that lead to more leave taking by women. Many are more generous and or more egalitarian than what's in place in the US, but none go far enough. Second, the research evidence suggests that the question, are generous work-family reconciliation policies good or bad for gender inequality, or good or bad for gender equality, is fundamentally a distributional question. A large literature has concluded that extensive work-family reconciliation policies are advantageous for most women, but there may be unintended consequences, mainly disadvantageous effects for women at or near the top, exactly the women that Claudia is studying. In the last 15 to 20 years, this question about unintended consequences has dominated the field. In my view, the literature is inconclusive. Still, there's some evidence for negative effects at the top, evidence that the very generous policies lower the glass ceiling and make it more impenetrable. Now, why does that occur? In countries that mandate, for example, generous paid leave and rights to reduced hour work, employers, it is argued, statistically discriminate against women because they know that, at least for now, take-up will be disproportionately female. Not wanting to cope with absent or reduced hour employees, they discriminate against women, especially the most highly skilled and highly paid women, where they, the employers, have made the most investment or expect to do so. So in short, it may be true that women at the top 2%, 5%, 10%, we don't really know the answer to that, are harmed, but the bottom 90% seem to benefit. I sometimes make the analogy to my students with US health policy and comparative perspective. Sure, if you're wealthy and have a rare brain tumor, you might want to be in the United States. But if you're a low-wage single mother with a child with asthma, you probably want to live somewhere else. So maybe women with MBAs and other elite degrees might find some advantages here in the Wild West that we call the US labor market, but most women would do better elsewhere, and that is largely because of public policies. Third, gender differences in time allocation are shaped by institutions, both public and private, but they're also sustained because many people the world over do gender, as we just heard about from Mary Blair-Loy. Several chapters in a recent book that I was just part of, Fatherhood in the Nordic Welfare States, makes a powerful case for the stickiness of gender norms, even in policy heaven. So Claudia notes on several occasions that gender norms are, of course, powerful in the US, but what sustains these gender norms? I realize that's not a question typically tackled by a labor economist, no matter how brilliant, but I still wanted to hear more. Why are gender norms so stubborn? And as I see it, reducing labor market gender gaps requires three axes of change. changes in employer behavior, absolutely, as well as expansion and reform of public policy and the dissolution of gender norms. In my understanding, all three processes are needed, and accumulating evidence suggests that they all drive and reinforce each other. So I would have liked to hear a little bit more about the intersection and the complementarity of these multiple axes of change, in practice, a rebalancing. So I think my point is clear, probably excessive by now. I'd like to hear a more sustained call for public policies along the lines of several that exist in many countries, especially effective limits on weekly and annual work hours, leave policies that offer entitlement to men and include incentives for their take-up. We know what those policy design elements are, and of course, generous and inclusive childcare. I think that with the proper policy architecture, we would see a narrowing of labor market gender differentials of all sorts, potentially not just at the bottom and in the middle, but at the top as well. So second, and very briefly, in her empirical work, Claudia equates family with having a child. Of course, as she acknowledges in the book and did today, that's a narrow conception of being a family or having a family. And I certainly understand that to carry out this empirical work, she needed to operationalize family somehow, and setting up this particular definition certainly seemed reasonable. In that case, though, I think this narrowness is costly. As we all know, many women who do not have children are situated in large, complex, extended families with partners, parents, siblings, nieces, nephews, in-laws, and, as in my own case, an array of chosen kin, some of whom are young children. These women may and often do have caregiving responsibilities that are as great or greater than those of their sisters who've given birth or adopted children. The equation of family with one's own children negates those realities, in my view, and muddies the analytic waters by assuming a starker difference than exists between women with and without their own children. I'm also concerned that equating family and implicitly caregiving burdens solely with one's own children is disadvantageous when calling for public policy reforms where supports are needed for a wider swath of the population. My discomfort with the equation of having a family with having children was intensified by some language in Chapter 7, in particular, that refers to having children as an indicator of success as well as achievement. I worry that that framing doesn't help when we turn our attention to calls for inclusive practices on the part of governments, employers, and the people who populate our private lives. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Janet. Really wonderful comments. And next, I am delighted to introduce to you all Dr. Helen Kowalewska, who is a lecturer and assistant professor in the Department of Social and Policy Sciences at the University of Bath. Welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me today, and also, of course, thank you to Professor Goldin for the book, which I really enjoyed reading. So I did prepare some slides, but I don't think I'll use them because they were quite bare anyway. So I'll just talk like everyone else has, so I don't kind of seem like I'm different from everyone. But so I really enjoyed the book as a social policy person rather than a historian. I learned a lot from the century-long journey that the book takes us on of kind of this incremental progress towards gender equality. And I really liked the dynamism of the book and how we saw the different tensions between family and care faced by each of the 5 generations of women at the center of the book, with the concept of greedy jobs as the key modern barrier to gender equality for the most recent group 5 women. And I really liked how women-centric and centered the book is. So even the title is Women's Century-Long Journey Towards Equity. So women are kind of rightfully recognized as the agents of change as well as its beneficiaries. And I liked how the book spotlights the stories of individual women who exemplify the different generations and were part of all those changes. And especially for someone who's not from the US and has never been in the US, I learned a lot about kind of lots of really interesting women like Margaret Gilpin-Reed and Lily Ledbetter. I also really liked the focus on greedy jobs because, and this has been touched on already by Janet, but we constantly talk about how we need to make family life more compatible with employment by providing more and better care services and getting men to lean into family life. And those are important, and the book does call for them. But the book's overriding focus, not on changing families, but on changing the world of paid work as the key to completing the gender revolution, is a nice kind of complement to the existing kind of focus on families. And also the idea of the issue of language. So like Claudia was saying, we need to give things specific names. And I thought some of the language used throughout the book was kind of helpful for being part of the change. So for instance, the book talks about being on call at home and names parents as essential workers. So it's only kind of when we have that more embedded language that we can kind of stop undervaluing care work within the family and kind of recognize it as work, and also take kind of more note of its immediacy and unpredictability and value. So I had a few remaining questions after I read the book. Firstly, while it highlights how demanding jobs are hindering gender equality, the corresponding demands of the family and how these might have changed throughout the century for women from group 1 through to group 5 aren't explored in as much depth. So we know that the amount of time that mothers, and not just fathers, are devoting to childcare has been increasing. So there was a study that showed how mothers tended to spend 50 minutes a day on average in 1965 on childcare for both college and less educated mothers. But by 2012, this time had increased and an education gap had opened up, so that more educated mothers spent around 2 hours a day on childcare and less educated mothers around an hour and a half. Whereas for college educated fathers, the corresponding figure was 1.25 hours. And this is against a backdrop of the intensive mothering ideology among higher income families, where so-called good mothering is being really involved in the minutiae of children's lives, and mothers are kind of expected to provide expert-guided, emotionally absorbing and labour-intensive care. And then there's the accompanying mum guilt that comes when you are working. Also, group 5 women are more likely to have elderly parents in need of care than previous groups. So they might have to navigate this responsibility too, because people are living for longer. So perhaps I wondered how the time bind created by families may have changed throughout the generations, and how this might be the kind of other half to the book's narrative on changes in kind of the demands of employment. Secondly, I wondered if reducing the costs of workplace flexibility is really the final chapter for gender equality. So this has been mentioned already, but kind of the influence of and the stickiness of gender roles and stereotypes and norms is kind of underplayed. But we know that in heterosexual couples where she earns more or works longer than him, and so she's the one who's on call at work, she's still often the one who's on call at home, because there's research that breadwinning women still perform more domestic work than non-breadwinning women. And we know how kind of the stickiness of this, of these roles. So for instance, Tina Miller's work on how kind of men do incompetence by ignoring the planning and organization that households require, telling their wives that they're incompetent. So women kind of carry the majority of family labor. Would affording men more flexibility really change this? And then there are also studies comparing female same-sex couples and different sex couples, and how birth mothers' leave uptake is higher than non-birthing mothers and parents in both same-sex and different sex couples. So the idea that there's kind of strong identities and internalized norms linked to ideas about the child's need for its birth mother specifically. Also, there's evidence that men and women might use workplace flexibility in different ways. So one study found that male doctors use their ability to control their work to put even more time into their careers, whereas female nurses use their workplace flexibility to help them meet their gendered family expectations. So in this way, the elimination of greedy jobs maybe isn't enough until we kind of prioritize the more fundamental problem of those gender roles, stereotypes and norms. And then third and finally, and again, this was touched on by Janet, as a social policy person, I was left wondering about government policies and how they can improve the situation. So yes, reducing the cost of more workplace flexibility is super important, but it seems unlikely this change will be kind of widespread across multiple industries without some kind of collective government intervention. And so the book talks about the usual policies of more childcare and parental leave, but these don't intervene directly in the structure of jobs to reduce the flexibility penalty. So I wondered a bit more about kind of more specific policies like job sharing, or in Portugal, for instance, the banning of employers from messaging staff outside of working hours. Also, more and more countries and companies have been experimenting with a 4-day working week. So we've actually done this in my family. So I had my daughter in 2020, and after I had her, my husband condensed his working week to 4 days, so that he had one weekday where he was solely responsible for all her care and I was out of the way at work. And I feel strongly that this has underpinned a really kind of equal arrangement in how we divide childcare and housework. So I wondered kind of the effectiveness of these and other policies are potentially something for future research to explore and build on the book's contribution. But thank you very much. I really enjoyed reading it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Helen. I know everyone's joining me in thanking you for your comments. And now I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Kris Marsh, who is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Maryland.
I am so happy to be here today and so excited to talk about the book. I too use Claudia in my notes, so I do hope that it's okay that I use Claudia or Dr. Goldin sometimes. I appreciate your opening statement and how your audience may not understand cohort in your book, so you went with group instead. I wish my publisher would have told me that, because I put cohort in the title of my book that's due to come out soon. So I'm excited to see if my audience can understand what I'm trying to get at. I want to offer 6 praises, and then I want to offer 3 things for us to think about. And I appreciate, and in the spirit of redundancy, because people have already said some of the things that I wanted to say, but I really appreciate the term greedy work. I really appreciate that. I wrapped my mind around that. I talked to several of my scholar friends, and they've already bought the book because I was just singing praises about it. And I also appreciate that you went into depth in chapter 10 and really talked more about on-call at home and on-call at work. So that was just a beautiful contribution. And I appreciate that. And I took that away from the conversation immediately in the beginning chapters. And then you really delved deeper in chapter 10. So I appreciate that. I also appreciate that you drew from high-profile people for the audience to really understand who you're talking about. You talked about famous economists, Nobel Prize winners, fictional characters in I Love Lucy and The Honeymooners as well. And I really appreciate it because it allowed the reader to really understand who we're kind of trying to talk about and tease out in the conversation. Similar to like some of the comments I think Janet made, I appreciate the fact that you defined family the way in which you defined family. And one of the things you said in the book, you said, no definition of family or career will be perfect for everybody, nor will it be all inclusive. And although I think that the term and family, the way in which you define it, because you yourself said that your partner and your dog would not show up as a family based on your own definition. I appreciate that, but I think it allows us to have a much larger conversation about family and how we should think about family. And so I really do appreciate that. So that's number 3. Number 4, side note. I enjoyed reading the hard copy, but I also didn't want to miss anything. So I bought the audio book as well. And the narrator did a fantastic job with the narration of the book. And talking in one case in particular, they were talking about the anesthesiologist who never married, the famous anesthesiologist, Abgor. I hope I'm saying that right. And so the narrator, she nails it because she says, it's just that I haven't found a man who can cook. So grappling with why they're being single, why they're choosing to marry. So the narrator did a fantastic job as a side note. Similar to what everybody has already said, please go to page 24 if you have not been to page 24, because it lays out a beautiful, absolutely stunningly beautiful, intellectual, historical, and visual journey of the 5 cohorts. I'm calling them cohorts now, but the 5 groups that you mentioned throughout the book. And the beautiful thing about these 5 groups is that you have grandmothers talking to children and grandchildren, grandmothers talking to granddaughters. And it's such a beautiful way because it allows us to look at the different groups and how they navigated work, family, and such. So I really appreciate the 5 groups because you don't see it often where grandmothers get to speak to granddaughters. So I really do appreciate that. And that was absolutely fabulous. One of the things I thought was kind of interesting though, too, is sometimes like I'm really interested in people that are never married and don't have children. And in some cases, it was really easy to find those that were never married and don't have children. But in other cases, it was hard to find both those that were never married and had no children. Sometimes it was an either or, sometimes it was both. And I was like, but I really appreciate the 5 groups. I also appreciate that you personalized it in several spaces throughout the book. You talked about your miniskirt and you talked about how Margaret Reed was walking through the snow and how you juxtaposing her and yourself and your miniskirt and her longer kind of outfit. That was interesting. But you also on page 112, you use a collective we and identified yourself as part of group 4. I did not try to calculate your age once you told us that, but I thought it was interesting because it's a very personalized touch. So those are the praises that I want to sing for the book, and they were fantastic. I do want to offer a couple of three ideas of conversation to talk about. The first one is that I would love to see more conversation about race. There were multiple places where I think that you could have added more conversation about race. One, in chapter 2, when you're talking about the high employment rates of Black women in particular, we could have drawn from sociologists Bart Landry, Andrew Billingsley, Evelyn Higginbotham, that talks about how Black women have to work along their Black husbands to maintain middle-class status. In a similar way, and there were spaces where you did talk about race. And when you did talk about race, I was so thankful because you didn't make Black people seem like they were doing something wrong. You just kind of said it's a little different for Black women. And I appreciate that you did it in a thoughtful way. There were spaces where I really wish you would have extended the conversation, especially in the opening chapter of chapter 5, when you talked about the honeymooners and you talked about I Love Lucy, and you talked about how the men were saying that, what did they say? I don't want my woman to work. And they talked about how these men are very dictator kind of men. Where does that leave the conversation around like Black men? We know that Black women had to work outside the home. That conversation is we're missing that conversation a little bit because we just don't have enough conversation about race. Also, you lay out a beautiful conversation about marriage bans and how Black women, unmarried Black women, and how in the South marriage bans looked a little differently. I would have loved to have a little more conversation around that, which I think leads directly into my second comment, and it dovetails very nicely with Mary has said about culture, what Janet has said about countries and family, and what Helen just said about being women-centered. Why isn't the book titled Career and Family, American White Women's Journey Long Century Toward Equity? I don't know that. I think sometimes the discussion about race gets in the way. If you say out the gate that you're talking about white women, then we don't have to worry about even indicting or having a conversation because race seems to get in the way. Just make it about white women. And to the point that's already being made, I think maybe white women in America. And then to my third and final point, and it's really good when you go last because you can drop other people's comments. My third and final point, I appreciate this conversation that you had about silver linings in your introduction, and you also have about in your book. And I want to end on a silver lining and gets back to the point that Janet was making, as well as the argument I was making about the praises. Your book lays the foundation. It continues to add to the foundation about how we think about family and about family should be more inclusive. And can you be a family of one? And thinking about caregiving and responsibilities. I am a single woman. My father lives in California, has Parkinson's. I have to fly from Maryland to California to take my father to his 15-minute neurology appointments. I have 2 sisters that live 30 minutes from him, but we're not going to talk about that right here on this call. But here's the point. I do believe that one of the things that you said, which I thought was powerful, in chapter 10, you talked about on-call, and you talked about the leaky pipelines. You also offered a silver lining, and you said, more people than ever are striving for couple equity and for time with their families. You also said in chapter 10, but a large chunk of the labor force consists of those with family responsibilities of some type. So in your work, either directly or indirectly, I think that you're dovetailing some of the work that I do that's talking about people that are single and living alone. And you're forcing us to think about who are families. Can you be a family of one? And or drawing from sociologist Andrew Billingsley's work, can you be these augmented family that I believe Janet was talking about, where there's no blood relation, but it definitely is a family. So you give us a really great platform to continue the conversation and to be as inclusive as we can be of families. So that's the silver lining that I try to offer about the book. So that's all that I have.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kris. I really appreciate your comments. And I'm delighted to introduce our final reader, Dr. Berkay Özcan, an associate professor in the Department of Social Policy in the School of Public Policy at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much for having me here. So about 15 months ago, we get the greatest honor to host Professor Goldin at the LSE and discuss about the book. The book was just out at that stage, and I had quite different questions than what I had them here now. And I feel a bit more at home among with my fellow sociologists, but I should also make the disclaimer that I'm actually a convert sociologist. I have a training in economics in undergrad and a training in grad school training in economics as well. So only in my last few years, I became a sociologist and social demographer. So I read this book with an eye on the papers that I recognize already in the literature that feed into the book. Majority of them were written by Professor Goldin, and I should say that the book is far, far more than the combination of those papers, and it offers a lot of insight. So I was fascinated by this book at the time when it came out. I reread it again for this talk, and I was fascinated again. And every time I read it, I find a lot of gems in it. So I learn more and more about it. It's also quite difficult to talk about this book at this stage after 5 excellent speakers have covered almost everything I was going to say. So I'll just make it quite brief in terms of what I wanted to hear about. But I think some portion of repetition might be useful as a point of second data. And I will start with Professor Blair-Loy's comments about the cultures, and that was one of the first things that was striking when I was reading the book. And then she is far more an expert on this area to speak about it. But I was wondering along the lines that when we were putting together all the cohorts and historical context, one of the things that have also changed over time is the understanding of motherhood, and literally when we were talking about how work has been historically and greedy, that we also think that motherhood might be also getting more greedy in terms of what is required of the mothers in terms of care qualities. And then there's sociological literature that discuss about parental schemas and intensive parenting and what is required of mothers. And that is spearheaded by the college-educated women predominantly. So that's that's kind of the population that is raising the bar about what is required and what is asked of the mothers. And I was wondering whether something could be said about that in the book, so that we understand that tension between care and work for this particular population subgroup. The discussion around the quality child and then increased standards in motherhood, in the care work, speaks directly to the policy context, but Professor Gornick has been mentioning about, how can we make the care costless, or flexibility can be costless. I mean, this is a bit timely to discuss this issue, so I appreciate the opportunity to the recent data in the US about the inflation, which is the biggest thing that we talk about these days, is one of the things that they have been over the last decade, 2 decades, far exceeding the average inflation rate has been the cost of care in the market in the US. And this is quite at odds when you think about the care workers' salaries, which are far below the inflation rates. And that is a market solution that actually we offer to sort out some of the tensions that greedy work is generating, and that college-educated women can actually utilize in the market. And at the same time that the prices are going in 2 different directions, and then that distributional effects on the non-college educated who are employed in the care sector is going to be hit by that dynamic. So I do think that just underlying what the Professor Gornick's position is, that public policies need to think about those distributional impacts of these flexibilization and then reducing the cost of care in multiple ways, so that there's no downstream effects on the rest of the women who are not the subject of the book. And the second thing that I was interested and learned a lot about it because of my personal interest was like in self-employment and autonomous work, which becomes kind of the core part of this discussion when we talk about what is a job versus what is a career. Increasing heterogeneity across the cohorts that we observe when we come closer to the state in the more recent cohorts, expansion in college education for an influx of women is now like having college education and then transitioning to work. That distinction becomes a bit more blurred about what is actually considered to be a job. There's a lot of platform work nowadays that employ a lot of college educated women to become somewhat self-employed or autonomous workers with pretty difficult conditions to understand in terms of protection and other securities. And that makes like the entire analysis in today's like discussion is like whether what we ask of employers in terms of offering solutions and what makes a greedy work and non-greedy work in terms of transition falls into these gray areas of like and also increasing autonomy and self-employment in certain type of jobs and then those jobs not being considered as careers. And I would like to hear a bit more on reflections today from Professor Goldin that the book has left me with some questions about it. And also, finally, I should just make the statement that because when we last talked about your book and at the LSE, it was 15 months ago, was in the still middle of the pandemic. And it was a very gloomy environment when we gave some minutes and discussions about how the pandemic actually hits women more disproportionately than men, especially college educated women, when greedy work is at present, and then their time demands were required. And now, like we're out of the pandemic a bit in most countries, and back to work hasn't happened as fast as like we were expecting, as you have mentioned in the introduction of today's talk, which I really appreciate. The sense that there's a bit more optimism in the sense than what we had before. Like, are we getting some benefits and silver lining like from the pandemic, and did we need some exogenous shock in that way to get that like silver lining, or could we just collectively organize ourselves in a way that we could sort it out and without the need of a dramatic event, which is a sad event as such? I should just finish here. I have a bunch of other notes that I wanted to talk, but they're all very well covered. So thank you very much for having me here again.
Thank you so much, Berkay. I really appreciate it. I know everyone's joining me again. And as we do so, I'm going to ask you all to just give a general round of applause for all of our panelists and readers and our author. It was just such a wonderful conversation. And now I would welcome questions from the audience. If you would like to ask a question, we would ask that you raise a hand, and it should bring your name up and I'll be able to call on you. If for some reason you are not able to ask a question out loud, you can put it in the chat and we will try to keep an eye on that as well. So thank you again to everyone. And Claudia, I think you had indicated that you did not want to respond, that you wanted to move straight to questions, but I did want to ask.
I don't want to respond. I just want to say two things. Mm-hmm. One is to thank the group, and no book is going to say it all, of course. If that were the case, we'd all be out of business. I always tell my students, there aren't answers to all questions, or else there's nothing for us to do. So the words that I take from this are, we should think more about culture and norms and the role of policy and the deeper meaning of family. I think that is of extraordinary importance, specifically when these groups, these cohorts are sort of interacting, when the cohorts of women have children later. Obviously, their parents, even though they're in better health, we're still bumping up into their issues. But two things we really must acknowledge as good sociologists and historians, that there have been gigantic changes in social norms historically. And we have to, rather than just say, oh, we still have social norms that are hindering, we really have to understand why there was change and why there are pockets of individuals in America and elsewhere. I was really saddened to read about New Zealand and what's going on in New Zealand now and the toxic environment in New Zealand, why there are periods in which women are in many ways taken advantage of, and where social norms go in the opposite direction, but why it is historically we have advanced enormously. What is it that went on? And the second point, very simply, is that the answer to everything is getting men on board. So thanks very much.
Wonderful, thank you. And now we'd like to open it up to questions for the audience. And so if anyone would like to raise a question, please go ahead and hit that little reaction button, and then you can hit, you should be able to raise your hand. All right, wonderful. Constanza, we'll go ahead and start with you and move to Jane next.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so I'm learning a lot reading this book, Dr. Goldin. So thank you so much. I haven't finished yet, but my question is maybe related to, sorry, there's some noise. It's like kind of similar to a observation about like how we define, or how you define in your book, families, but it's like the opposite part of the equation is how you define careers. And I'm thinking about how that also, and I know, like, as you just said, like, this is like, you are looking at one group, one like college degree, women with college degrees, but also how that, what implications do you see on like this definition of career versus jobs? Because I was thinking when I was reading how this definition, who is included or excluded from that, and what options other women, like middle class maybe women, or women who didn't go to college have to build a career. And like, for example, if someone is just like employed her whole life, but without like going up in the hierarchy, like we are saying that person is not building a career, but maybe like it's as meaningful for her like situation as it is like having a career. I don't know if that's clear, but yeah, thank you.
Do you want me to answer, Sarah? Okay, it's an extremely good question. And there are definitions that we can use as you just expressed that are meaningful, that what I love to read about are women who are non-college graduates and who when interviewed say that they want a career that is a part of their identity, that it's not so much what they're earning, but something that they believe in, something that they want to continue with, something that they're investing in themselves. That's really what I would like. The operational definition, and everyone can look at the operation. We have to have some operational definition, and therefore I do have an operational definition, but it's going to include those who we might not want to include, and it's going to exclude some who we would want to would want to include. So I think that we should think about it not so much in terms of their earnings, not so much in terms of their position in society, but their own personal striving and their own personal sense that what they do today will impact them in not just tomorrow, but in their future. Thanks.
Thank you, and thank you for that question. I think next we have Dr. Waldvogel.
Thanks. Thank you for organizing this event. It's fabulous. So I wanted to underscore the point that Janet made and that Kris made about the importance of thinking about care for family members who are partners or spouses or older adults, parents, older relatives, especially as women get older themselves. And I think there's been much less research on older workers and their care responsibilities, and much less public policy development in those areas. And I'm raising it because as a comment, but also as a question and an invitation for Claudia to comment, because I know in some of her more recent work, this is something that she's working on. And if you could just mention some of what you're doing, that would be fabulous.
First of all, it's wonderful to see you, Jane. These are great events, bringing people who were once physically together in the same space, now together in some other space. And I agree entirely that this is an area that, a research area. Once again, we haven't answered all the questions. Jane, I think, is referring to the fact that I edited a volume and did work on the notion of women working longer, that in the US, the largest increase in female labor force participation in the 20, 30 years before the piece that I wrote, which was probably written around 2010 or so. The largest increase was women 55 years and older. We heard before that the labor force participation rate of American women hit a plateau. It's very, very important for us to understand why it's hit this plateau. We know it's a plateau because other countries, such as the one just north of ours called Canada, has advanced beyond that. And so we know it does have something to do with policy. But we also know that in the US, among women 55 and older, in the period that I was looking at, they have greatly advanced their participation. And part of that is that they were my group for getting older. They had this identity in their career. They weren't going to just stop and retire. They were in the labor force because they got something out of it that was more than just the earnings that they brought home. But it's also important to put that together with the caregiving part. So I have not done all of that, Jane, sorry.
Thank you. And thank you for the question, Jane. Next, we have Marbella Ebony Hill. Dr. Hill, we're looking forward to your question.
Hi, thank you so much for this event. I've loved it, and I could listen to you all mull over these topics all day. One question that I have, and I'm hoping that maybe Dr. Goldin has some thoughts about this or has been considering it. So one persistent tension in the literature is on the topic of choice and autonomy related to women's work and family decision-making. So there's a tendency for scholars to criticize some choices, particularly those that privilege family, potentially at the expense of work or socioeconomic mobility. And I think that those sort of leave other choices, particularly those that privilege work and educational attainment, without any critique or real nuanced consideration. And so I'm wondering if maybe if there is space to expand or reconsider how we're thinking about the choices that women make. And recently I was rereading Richay Barnes' Uplifting the Race book, and it's about different choices that Black career women make. And a subset of her sample chose to be like stay-at-home mothers or modified stay-at-home mothers. And there has been some critique about that choice that she sort of raises in the book, but I think that we could have more conversation about it, and just wondering about what your thoughts might be related to that choice and autonomy.
I would say that I agree entirely with you that we have to think harder about that. I don't have any thoughts about saying that one, certainly one is not better than another, but it is important in the US to make certain that we are all in the same space. So as many of us know as historians, women are a very, very strange group to unify. We're of different races, different ethnicities, different ages. We are very, very hard to unify. And when the women's movement began in the second wave in the 1960s, and we were unified, and we were unified in large measure because of the civil rights movement. This is sort of a difficult thing to unpack. We came together to support women's rights, independent of what their choices were. But at the same time, we apparently left behind a group of women who felt as if they were threatened. And they band together in a group that was the Stop ERA group. And in the US, it continued till today. We have these two groups as if one is better than the other, that one is looking down on the other, that one has to fear the other. And I think that that has been a terrible conflict that has continued from Phyllis Schlafly's Stop ERA movement, from the January 1973, suddenly we had abortion that was legal. That led to another movement that said there is choice or there is pro-life. That was another big conflict here. So I don't think that this is a simple thing to say there's choice or not choice. I do think that women as a group came together and then we were split apart in ways that we still haven't grappled with. So thank you very much for opening this very, very difficult part of the American psyche apart. Thanks. Did you realize that you opened that up in that manner?
No, I didn't, but I'll take it.
Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that question. Next, we have a question from Dr. Miha Swang. Looking forward to it. Thank you. We did. Did we lose you? I think. Oh, do you want to go ahead? Are you unmuted?
She's still here.
Sorry, my connection may not be very good. Sorry for that. Thank you so much for the wonderful webinar of the concept of gritty work. It was really like a light bulb went up when I first came across this concept. Yeah, I was hoping to pose this question to maybe Dr. Goldin, but also this fabulous panel of readers we have today. With this puzzle that I have been kind of grappling with when I'm trying to understand women's navigation of careers. And it's how this advancement in gender equality, ideas around gender norms, social roles, these have advanced in Scandinavian countries. And I would say the public policy is probably better than in the American context with regards to childcare or healthcare. But at the same time, I feel like they also provide more flexibility in the workplace as well. But at the same time, we also observe that the glass ceiling phenomenon is more prominent in the Scandinavian countries. compared to other contexts where we may see less of a gender equality in social norms and culture. And even we see more greedy work culture in other countries as well. I was wondering, with this family idea coming up, Scandinavian countries are also known to be a great place to have a family, very child-friendly. Yeah, I was kind of thinking, are they kind of interrelated, this family element, because it's so great to have families? Is that in some ways kind of interlinked with that gender inequality persisting in invisible ways that obstruct women's advancement in careers?
Let me say one thing, and then I think that Janet will have much to say on this, as Mary as well, I think. Policy differences are sometimes a double-edged sword. So there are several countries, the Netherlands is one, that, so if we think back, the Netherlands in the 1970s, 80s, female labor force participation rates were rock bottom. And so a policy was passed, which was that if you were working 5 days a week, you could, at the same hourly wage, ask to work 4 days a week. And then you could ask to work 3 days a week. And hours, if you look at the OECD numbers, hours of work for women, for Dutch women, are very, very low. And it sounded like a great policy because it got around greedy work, because you got the same hourly wage. It was pro rata. Now, that was like today, it looks good. But what about next year and the year after? Are you going to hire a woman into a position, let's say a managerial position, in which the work doesn't end after 22 hours a week? And so that's where it becomes a double-edged sword. Let me pass this on to perhaps.
I think that was me. Thank you. Thank you so much for asking me to step in. Let me try to be brief, which has never been my strong suit. I think this is a great question. Just to say, I have spent almost 35 years studying social policy in other countries with a focus on wealthy countries, especially Canada, Australia, and Central and Northern Europe. And indeed, they're very heterogeneous. I think we know that. We're talking about the Nordic countries specifically. There is no in Europe, as I'm sure you all know, in the same way that we have such variety across the 50 states in the US. So that's a complicated question. But I do just want to say a couple of things that we know from the Nordic country. Actually, we know from the whole European Union. Let me just go back in time and say, I wrote a book that was published in 20 years ago, my goodness, this year, called Families That Work. And my colleague Marcia Myers and I looked in depth at 12 countries at 3 areas of public policy: childcare, paid leave. And then I inserted, because I was working on a policy on working time. And I do just have to say, a lot of Americans said, what are you talking about? I don't even know what you're talking about, literally, because there are policy mechanisms we've never seen here. Europeans knew what we were talking about. So the regulation of working time is a huge part of the discussion abroad. Claudia, you're clearly going to, explode it here, I hope. Very briefly, there are 4 kinds of policy that are very common. One is capping weekly work hours. Another is mandating a minimum number of days off per year, which are called paid days off. I would also like to argue that we should not use the word vacation because it doesn't help politically. This is not vacation. This is defining full year work. Third, the European Union requires part-time parity in pay and prorated benefits. As Claudia said, it's not easy to enforce. But I've done empirical work on the part-time, full-time wage gap across countries, and the US has a large one. And the final thing is, and I just would say, I wrote a small monograph some years ago with Ariane Hagebusch at IWPR, in which we looked at the question of the rights to flexible and reduced hour work. The US is way behind in all of this. Many European countries have a statutory right to reduced hour work. In Sweden, you can work 3/4 time till your child is 8. Without, in theory, anything other than a prorated, loss of benefits and money. Many countries have a procedural right. You have the right to request work hour changes and to have those requests reviewed. The use of flexible work is also it's more gender egalitarian than other types of policies. So there's lots to be said. We're silent on huge numbers of policy mechanisms that are well tested. Of course, there are concerns. The issue with part-time work, we always raise the issue about, creating new forms of gender inequality, which we've talked about. I still think the advantages on the whole outweigh the disadvantages, but there's lots of enormously important literature, and the regulation of working time, again, must be on the policy agenda in the US, and it really hardly is anywhere ever. So thanks for raising this question.
Wonderful, thank you all. Do we have any further questions from the audience or any additional responses from our panelists to share?
Sarah, I'll just say
wonderful. Go ahead, Mary.
In response to that great question and Janet's great answer, and Janet's earlier remarks about how the national context, including policy context, is such an important level of analysis. Yet it's also the case that in international companies, the national, say that are headquartered in the US, or they're competing with countries in the US, companies in the US, that there's despite these, more potentially gender egalitarian policies in Nordics, for example, they see themselves, that the people working for large corporations at the top, the leaders, they see themselves as competing with the US greedy organizations, greedy companies. And so this creates pressure to continue to have those kinds of expectations for managers that are viewed as rocketing to the top versus those who are viewed as not as serious.
Thanks, Mary. I don't see any more hands in the chat. So before we end today, and I'm going to start by saying a big thank you again to everyone who's sat on our panel, and to Claudia for writing this fabulous book, and also to the WFRN staff and Dr. Raven Chandler, who did a lot of the organizing work of this event. We really appreciate it. And before we go, I'd like to ask Claudia if you have any final thoughts that you'd like us to. I feel like we should give you the last word, and I know everyone would join me in wanting to hear what that word is, and so we'll close there. Oh, and I'll remind you that it's membership week for WFRN, and I'm going to put it in the chat again.
Okay, so the first thing is that I want to thank everybody and remind them that it's membership week. And what I said before, I mean, which is that the main points that have been raised by the readers are excellent. That's why we're here. We're not here to praise, we're here to move forward. We are academics. We need to learn. And as a historian, I'm always reminding people that we have to learn from history, and that we have to understand why there's progress and why there isn't. And I've pointed that out in various ways. And I love the notion that we have to think more broadly about the meaning of family. And of course, that's what this network is all about. So once again, thanks very much for reading the book and for pushing this forward. Without criticism, without thinking hard about these difficult subjects, we will not make progress. Thanks.
Thank you. And thank you all. And thank you so much to our readers for providing such wonderful comments as well. And thank you all for joining us. It's been a fabulous session.
Okay, wait, Sarah, are we supposed to stay on? Because I know my calendar says from 10 to 12.
Oh, I think it was originally just to grab the time. We're supposed to go to 11:30, but I think that.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Good to see you, Kris.
No,
Kris, you have a free